Okay, everyone, welcome back. We will roll into our third session. I hope the calibration went well. The weather's perfect out there. So our next speaker is going to be familiar to us because Dana was just up in the last session. But I'd like to thank him for helping us out because we had somebody unfortunately back out. So Dana was excited enough to talk more about his work, and we're excited to hear about it. So let me welcome back to the podium, Dana Allen.
Thanks. Appreciate it. All right, hi everyone, I'm back. I'll try not to tell the same jokes this time, so you'll have something new. But anyway, there was a question in the last presentation about wells and impact to wells, and so that was very apropos because now we're going to be talking about wells. So we're sort of talking about mapping Vermont's municipal salt storage facilities. So obviously I have a thing for salt storage. Everyone likes to talk about roads and application with salt, and I like to talk about storage sites. So we're talking about storage facilities with respect to drinking water sources, and we'll dive into that a little bit. This was a study that I did with Dr. Stephanie Hurley at UVM. And again, she's the PhD, and so some of this stuff is more her bailiwick than mine, although a lot of this is GIS. So I got to do a lot of mapping work, which is what I like to do. So this was really great for me. We have some other acknowledgements. This was a USGS grant. The Vermont Water Resources and Lakes Studies Center. I'd like to thank our research assistant, Oscar Ewald. Oscar crushed it for us. He was an undergrad who was actually quite responsible, like oddly so. Was waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning to talk to public garages throughout Vermont, which goes above and beyond if you're an undergrad. Is Chris Stepanek in the room right now? I don't see Chris. Anyway, Chris is around. She gave us a lot of good ideas for this study and was actually part of the initial grant application process. Had some people from DEC, notably Scylla Larson. If you're interested in impacts to drinking water and wells, her work when she was at DOH, Department of Health, is really fundamental to that. So look that up if you're interested. It's a great study. And then we had some help from Vermont Rural Water Association, VTrans, the Vermont Agency of Transportation. DG was a great guy and gave us a lot of good data. And then researchers from UVM gave us actually a great resource, which we're probably not going to go into today, the Vermont Environmental Disparity Index, which is a really fascinating product about basically environmental justice in Vermont and some of the factors that influence that. And it actually ranks census blocks by environmental disparity, which we used in our research to get at, is there a difference in impact to, or potentially a difference in impact to drinking water sources in some of these more environmentally disparate areas. We don't have enough time to talk about that today, but it is part of our overall report. So what we are going to talk about is the background and study goals. We're going to talk about our methods, primarily database creation and mapping, and the selection of wells and water sources. And so that's something we are going to be talking about, private wells and public water sources, because that's essentially how everyone gets their water in Vermont. We're not going to be talking about the EDI. Please look up the Vermont Environmental Disparity Index if you have interest. It's very well done. It's a great story map. It's a really cool product. I'd like to see other areas adopt it. We also did an analysis of school proximity, to see if there are school water sources within proximity to some of these storage sites. We're not going to be talking about that as much today, but primarily in our results and discussion, we're going to be talking about the locations and descriptions of facilities, and then wells and water sources down gradient of facilities. And I'm going to be talking a lot about what I mean by down gradient or down gradients, and conclusions and next steps. So, use of de-icing material or road salt has increased in Vermont. We could go through like a million slides that would show you that, but instead we're just going to say that it has increased because it has. Chemicals and de-icing materials can pose a risk to drinking water because they can leach materials from certain types of pipes, notably lead. We've seen this in places like Flint, Michigan. We see it in places like Vermont where we have older infrastructure, older houses, lead pipes. maybe even some municipal service lines that may still have residual lead in there. That's not good for humans. So salt in water is not just water tasting gross, it's actually a health risk. Like I said before, de-icing material pollution, with roads, it's typically distributed and ephemeral. Salt is applied in the winter, it kind of leaches out over the course of the summer. That can still have an impact on wells, but we wanted to get at, is there an impact associated with these point sources or more point sources? Is it a localized perennial source of pollution? And essentially, prior to this study, no mapped database of de-icing material storage facilities existed in Vermont. So if nothing else, we created a novel spatial product with this study, at least for the Lake Champlain portion of Vermont, because that's what our funding was good for, that gives future researchers something to use. So we're actually pretty proud of that, or at least I am. All right, so how'd we do this? We wanted to survey municipalities in the Lake Champlain Basin. We wanted to map their storage facility location. We wanted to get a little bit more data in there too, so our data set was a little more robust. So not just location, but material type, storage methods. Is it covered? Is it on an impervious pad? This is important. Salt will go into the ground very easily. So if you're just storing it on native soils or gravel, that's not really going to cut it as far as sequestration goes. And how long has it been there? Has it been there for a year? Maybe there's not a whole lot of impact. Has it been there for 40 years, 50 years? All right, now we have some residual issues potentially. And then we wanted to analyze facility locations with respect to distance from private wells and public water sources. So distance is important, but also down gradient estimation. And we'll get into why down gradients is potentially important, as well as why that's a little bit problematic. If not to say janky in some ways, as far as like how we determine impact potentially. We also looked at school water sources and vulnerable communities using the EDI. Again, not going to go into that today as much. We're going to talk about some methods real quick with respect to database development. So again, municipal facilities mapping, that was direct contact with town officials. And again, that was our undergraduate research assistant, Oscar, getting up ungodly early for a 19-year-old in college. 5 o'clock for like 3 months. I can't say enough. That would not have been me in college. And so he was able to get all of that information based on what they told him. Is that field verified? It is not. We were able to visually verify a lot of this using satellite imagery. We did not go out into the field and independently verify any of these claims. So this is a terrible salt pun. Take the data with a grain of. Yeah, thank you. That's a dad joke. VTrans facilities mapping, we obtained that information directly from VTrans. So again, not independently field verified. So just what they were able to tell us, we were able to more or less correlate it with satellite imagery, but beyond that, we're not going out and testing, is this rock salt versus something else? Okay. We want to know if these wells are potentially being influenced by these facilities. And one way we can do that is determining whether or not they're essentially downhill of the facility. Why is that important? Well, okay, if salt is going into the ground and then groundwater is roughly following surface water flow patterns, surface water going downhill is also flowing downhill as groundwater. That's a gross oversimplification of how groundwater works. But basically, if you see that giant blue arrow, that's our initial supposition, right? If it's downhill, groundwater's going that way. Well, when does that work? Well, it works when topo equals hydraulic, right? Groundwater's flowing the same direction as the topography. It's going downhill. When does it not work? Topo does not equal hydraulic when you have things like bedrock fractures or other superficial geology that impact that. So did we look into that? Are we able to analyze that across the entire Lake Champlain Basin? We are definitely not. Geographer by training, not a geologist by training. So there may be a way to refine this methodology. However, for this spatial scale, we didn't do that. We weren't able to do that. What's another example? Well, God, there's so many animations on this one. All right, so surface flow. Again, there's the topo, but then there's a groundwater lens down there, right? This makes sense. Like there's gonna be some base level of groundwater in there. Well, we have a facility location near that groundwater lens. And there's a well site that's topographically uphill. So logic would say, well, water's not going to flow uphill, so groundwater's not going to flow uphill. But what about if that well is particularly deep, taps into groundwater, and then that groundwater is actually below the facility location? Topo doesn't equal hydraulic. So could we get at that using well depth? Yes, we could. Is the well data that we have in Vermont good enough for that? 50% of the time, maybe. And also, we don't know groundwater depth. So there's a lot of unknowns here. So again, take this data with a grain of salt. Sorry to make the same pun twice. But that's kind of like, those are our data limitations. So when we say something is downhill and potentially impacted by a facility, these are the considerations to draw, or these are the considerations to have when looking at that data, the caveats rather. All right, so how did we get at location and down gradients? Well, essentially we took all of the assigned wells and water sources, and we have a pretty good data set in Vermont going back to like 1967 for wells. And we assigned them elevations from LIDAR. So we have good elevation data for the state of Vermont. And then we used 5 selection distances of 30, 60, 100, 200, and 300 meters. And we'll talk about why those distances were used. And then we used the National Hydrography Dataset high resolution catchment data to determine drainage area boundaries. And again, we wanted to know, like, if a facility is in a particular drainage area, that indicates topographic flow of water. That could also indicate a higher risk for groundwater flow to certain of these wells. So the distances from wells mapped, those are taken from a couple of sources. The 30 meter was based on a study from 1982 in Vermont by Craig Heindel, who's a hydrogeologist in the area, who found that there is some salt impact to wells within 30 meters of roads. And that actually was found again in 2018 in a study from New York, Pieper et al. And that's one of our primary sources for why we chose this method. 60 meters is basically 200 feet. If anyone does real quick metric to imperial conversions, that's about accurate. That's the minimum distance in Vermont for wellhead protection. And then we basically used 100 to 300 meters to broaden our search distance just to give us a little bit bigger data set. Because frankly, we weren't finding a lot within that 30 and 60 meters. So what does that look like? All right, so these are the maps that we created. At the top there, you kind of see an overview. That big black line, that's the NHD catchment. So that's the drainage area that the facility is in. We did apply a little bit of a buffer, so that blue triangle is the facility. And we kind of took the drainage areas that were near it, so a 60-meter selection distance. And then we mapped all the facility, or we mapped all the wells, and we were able to assign whether they were lower or higher. So the facility got an elevation, and then all the wells got an elevation, the water sources got an elevation. And then we determined whether they were higher or lower based on the facility location. You can see those rings, the 30, 60, 100, 200, 300 meter distances are all those little concentric yellow rings. And so notice at the top there we have that green droplet. That well is higher, so maybe it's at less risk. The other one at the bottom there, it says lower in orange. That's maybe at higher risk. So we created these maps for all of the municipalities that we looked at in Vermont. And so, we were able to do this for 126 municipalities in Vermont. We had 122 locations across 118 towns. We missed a few towns, they didn't respond. A few towns have a couple different facilities. 43 towns have multiple materials. We had about 170 individual material piles. 21% of total piles are uncovered. So that sounds risky, but when you start to look at it, it's actually 27 of those are salt and sand piles. Primarily the reason being we've had funding for years to cover salt piles, and if you leave your salt pile uncovered, you're not going to have a salt pile for very long. So we're not seeing a lot of totally uncovered salt piles. That's not really a thing that's occurring. But we are seeing a lot of salt and sand piles that are uncovered. 8 of them were allegedly sand only or sand and gravel. I have my doubts, but again, we didn't verify this individually. And then one was kind of a question, magnesium chloride. VTrans states that all their materials are covered and on pads. So they're using management practices, kind of like we saw with their Shelburne transload facility. So the results. We had about 1,600 wells, which were within 300 meters or within an NHD catchment. So that's 1,600 wells that are in some proximity to these facilities, 44% of them are down gradient. So that 44% are potentially at risk, which is not an insignificant number. I will say that the well data is potentially not complete. There may be more than that. That well data is reliant on people voluntarily reporting, essentially when they drill a well, where the well is. I think more interestingly, 1,000 of these, or a little over 1,000, were within those catchments and those drainage areas. And so I think that those potentially have a higher risk just because topographically they may be more related, and therefore by groundwater they may be more related. And 63% of those are down gradient. So again, not necessarily being impacted, but they are lower than the facility. So that's a significant number, within those catchments. They may be within a far distance, but we don't know that. And then we had 51 public water sources within 300 meters or within a catchment, and 63% of those were downgraded in the nearest facility. So it's a not an insignificant number of potential wells within some level of impact. However, we only found 15 wells within 30 meters of those facilities. So if we look at 30 meters as like a really critical distance, we're only looking at 15 wells that are within that really critical distance. And I forget how many of those were down gradient. I don't know if I actually did that. I'm sure I did, but I didn't put it on here. So note to the next presentation, do that. So again, if I were gonna go out and like look at priorities, I'd probably look at those 15 for testing and then move to the 60 and the 200. So that could be a future study. So these are the maps that we created. We've kind of gone over this a little bit, but essentially what we did is we have our storage facilities. They're coded, covered or not covered, and then there's VTrans facilities. Private wells have one legend, public water sources have another, and then you see those drainage area boundaries in black, and then all of those rings in yellow. So we created these for each town. And then there's like a little key at the top that shows a larger area. And so we have a bunch of different examples of how this played out. Now some towns like Alburgh, if those of you are familiar with Alburgh at all, pretty small town, there are essentially no wells in proximity to that facility. So very little risk up there, which is good because they have a very shallow depth to groundwater. Their water also tastes like eggs. Then we have a place like Chittenden, very few wells in proximity, and the one that is in proximity really close by does seem to be higher. There are a few that are lower. So that's just another example of a covered pile with a few wells in proximity. So potentially not a huge impact there. And then we have another area. You'll see a few examples like this in the data set where we have these overlapping rings. That's actually an area in Westfield. Bonus points for anyone who knows where Westfield is. I don't offhand. But they have a VTrans facility, or two VTrans facilities in proximity to the municipal facilities. So that's why we have all of this overlap there. So we think that we've created something that is potentially useful for towns to use to kind of see like if they want to prioritize testing of these wells, they can quickly see where these are and determine if they have anything to, if they have an issue there to solve. Also for some of these towns with uncovered salt and sand piles, there are funds out there to potentially mitigate some of this impact. So that's a prioritization that can be used. And so there are grant programs where we can, now that we actually have this database, and again, I think this is really important, now that we actually have a database cohesive for the Lake Champlain Basin, we can actually reach out to some of these towns where they have uncovered salt and sand piles and say, hey, listen, there's money for you. We can help mitigate this. What we didn't want to do in this study is just point a finger and say, you have a problem. We wanted to at least give people a tool whereby they could find a solution. So we've started on that process. We'd like to do it for the rest of Vermont, funding contingent. So our conclusions. We've got a novel, publicly available spatial database. All of this data lives on Vermont's Open Geodata portal. And if you're not familiar with the Geodata portal, it's a really great asset for the state of Vermont. I've used Geodata in New York. Vermont is very centralized. New York is not as centralized. And so we really have a great product there. And so we wanted to make sure that it was placed there so that people who did want to prioritize some of these projects could do so if they wanted to. And we also conducted this initial assessment of risk to private wells and public water sources. So, prior to this, as I said, Scylla Larson at DOH had done a study looking at voluntarily collected and reported drinking water data, like well water data, with respect to chloride. And so, she was able to leverage that data set to kind of see like, okay, we've got these results from these different wells. Can we match it up to roads or other factors like agricultural fields and start to determine like what are we seeing in terms of impact to wells. Now we have another data set where we could take that same well water data that's been reported over the years and start to look at, okay, of these wells that have reported, chloride for their drinking water, are we seeing an impact based on where they are with respect to these municipal facilities or not? So again, just giving researchers another tool, and again, we'd like to expand this. I think that was our next steps. Yeah, improving on methods for determining down gradients, or basically like hydrologic and hydraulic connectivity. So are they actually connected to groundwater? Like, is there a groundwater impact? So then that really starts to look at, gosh, there was a study from over here, Kelly et al. In 2020-ish, something like that, that actually used like surficial geology and topography as well as hydrologic soil groups to start to get at like, okay, how easy is it for salt that's going into groundwater to move? Because if you're in D soils, like hydrologic soil group D, doesn't allow that much water in. Hydrologic soil group A tends to allow more water in. Surficial geology, you start to get at things like bedrock fractures and like how easy it is to get into the ground. So then we can start to look at that and say like, okay, is this more or less of a concern based on those factors? Not just topography, which is what we used, possibly also looking at well data, so depth of well, depth of groundwater, things like that. So we're finding that. Testing, love to do some testing. We've applied for funding to do that. We haven't gotten it yet, but that would be a really great thing to do, especially for some of those wells, like those 15 wells within 30 meters, or then stepping up to the 60 meters, or looking at school water supplies, because there are some which are in proximity to municipal facilities. And so, trying to get at, is there more of a problem here? Because, now kids are involved, and so like lead in kids' drinking water isn't a good thing. And then taking this statewide in Vermont, potentially expanding it over to this side, and the Quebec portions as well, would be a really great thing. Lake Champlain Basin Program would fund something like that over here, or in Quebec. And then we have to find funding for the rest of Vermont. That's pretty much what I have. Here are some links. That's the entire map index and the written report if you want to go into detail, especially if you want to hear about the vulnerable community analysis and the Vermont EDI. That's really interesting. The TLDR on that is that we didn't actually find a lot of difference with respect to environmental disparity with this data. Yet, using that data is still important. So check it out if you're interested, or Google Vermont Environmental Disparity Index to see that data a little bit more. And with that, I can take questions for a couple minutes, yeah? Yep. Okay.
I don't see any questions. We'll start out over there. Oh, it's all right.
Is anyone starting to map this from the perspective of chronic illness? Are they beginning to connect or use your data to research?
No, not yet. I mean, again, our data is pretty new. This is actually only the second time I presented on this data. We presented in 23, sometime like after we finished it. So it's pretty new data. So no is the short answer, but that would be great to see, especially because like we know that lead has an impact on health. And also, I mean, like frankly too, like salty water can lead to like hypertension in certain people. So again, like there is a health impact from the salt itself, not just what it leaches. So I think casting this in terms of like human health, not just this abstract environmental problem, is important. So, but hasn't happened as yet.
okay, I'm probably not going to use the right words, but you talked about the depth of the water and the hydraulic, whatever it was you talked about. So if I understand this in lay terms, if I can dig a hole on my property that's 7 feet deep and it fills up with a foot of water, I'm in a pretty high watershed.
You're in a high water table, yeah.
So, like, if the state was using 100% salt and the downgrade is down from the street to my well, and it's less than 30 meters, it's safe to say that the contamination of my well is coming from the 100% salt, chloride? Is that what I'm supposed to be testing for?
So as a researcher, I wouldn't say it's safe to say.
Okay.
I would say that there's a possibility.
Now my
and
next
based on
question is-
testing. And Pieper et al. In a study in Orleans and Kelly et al. In East Fishkill, 2 studies from New York that looked at precisely that. So
I will look into that,
Okay.
thank you. My next question is, if the option that's been given to me is to put a claim in to get a new well drilled, that's not gonna help me, because if my water table is only 7 feet deep and they drill me another well, my well's only 65 feet deep right now, and I'm having a problem. How is that gonna fix the problem? Really, reverse osmosis is the only way to make that correction?
again,
Sorry.
sounds like a cop-out. No, it sounds like a cop-out. But like, as a researcher, I couldn't definitively tell you, and also not as a well drilling professional, I couldn't definitively say yes or no, it won't fix it. However, reverse osmosis is a proven way to reduce or eliminate the impact of de-icing salt to drinking water. So if it were my house, that's probably what I would do. But that's, again,
So when you put in a salt claim to the state, why are they giving you an option to drill a new well and not reverse osmosis?
I'm going to cop out again, not a regulator. And also from Vermont, so I don't know the process in New York.
Hi, I just wanted to speak on this real quick, just from a Connecticut perspective, because we do have private wells throughout the state that are impacted. Just as you said, you can't speak to whether it'll always work or not, but we actually have had a significant amount of success with drilling new wells. Typically, though, they need to be deeper and they need a lot more casing on them, that metal tubing that goes into the ground to shut off any potential surface water that's salt-laden from getting into the well. On the other hand, we have had a few very rare cases where a new well drilled deeper tapped into saltier water that was associated with a salt storage shed a significant distance away because of the connectivity between those two places. But again, very rare that that's happened. Typically in Connecticut, we find the reverse osmosis method to be kind of the last-ditch effort because it's a very significant cost to install one of those systems. In Connecticut, we have different standards for discharge of any treatment systems in your house for any of that wastewater, but we can talk about that after.
Dana, I have one question. Are you aware of any other studies in any other states similar to this?
Okay, so there was that Pieper or Piper, and then the Kelly et al. I think they were both around 2018, 2020-ish. Again, both of those from New York. Beyond that, offhand, no.
Okay.
We did look around. We did a lit review, but primarily focused on like methods. So not offhand, no. Other than the study that Scylla did in Vermont, which was again slightly different than this, but actually a very good study and worth reading.
Okay.
So.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dana. Appreciate it. Good. Before I get into the introduction of the next speaker, I'm real excited when I'm able to bring a waterkeeper or somebody that works with Waterkeeper here. I was fortunate enough a couple of years ago, we had the CEO, Mark Yagi, of Waterkeeper Alliance here, and our next will be the second Waterkeeper I'm obviously very biased to waterkeepers because we do a great job to protect our waters around the world. And I just spent the last week with, we had our global conference, so I'm just always impressed with the work that they do. Dan Shapley will be our next presenter. Dan is the Senior Director of Riverkeeper Advocacy, Policy, and Planning Program. He's worked with Riverkeeper for 13 years, and that was actually the first waterkeeper program that there was down on the Hudson. He's analyzed thousands of water samples per year, helped form the Hudson 7, which is an intergovernmental body in the Hudson Valley organized to safeguard drinking water, and was the 2023 winner of the Environmental Advocate Award in Chronogrammy's Reader's Choice. I don't know if I blew that, but he's a part of our waterkeeper movement dedicated to making our waters swimmable, fishable, and drinkable. So please welcome Dan Shapley.
All right. I'm putting the regional in the regional conference here because I'm taking us out of the park a bit. But thanks so much, Chris, and all the organizers for this great event. I'm super impressed. I've heard about it for years, but this is the first time that I've been here. So I'll be talking about impacts of road salt on public drinking water supplies in the Hudson River watershed. And obviously, right now today, we're not in the Hudson River watershed, but it's not that far away. And obviously, a big part of the Adirondack Park drains into the Hudson River. So where's my slide clicker?
It's on the podium.
Green button. All right, here we go. All right. All right, little slide snafu there, but you'll stick with me. So just summarizing some of, and I'm not a PhD scientist, just like Dana, I work with a PhD water quality scientist, Shannon Roback, who's not here today. So I'm gonna deliver this from a layman's perspective, what I take away from the science, without a whole lot of graphs and charts and data to show it. But these are some of the takeaways that I have from understanding some of the science that's been done more in the lower watershed of the Hudson River. But obviously, like a lot of places, we have widespread and increasing evidence of salt concentrations and fluxes in the Hudson and tributaries. We have the highest concentrations are associated with the seasonal low flow periods, March and September. So that's when we have the lowest water volumes in our streams, and we're seeing that base flow contribution from the polluted groundwater that has the evidence of salt in it. And then those watersheds that are showing the highest impacts have certain watershed characteristics, lots of imperviousness, as well as associated with different soil types and proximity to roads and stormwater runoff rates. And we just mentioned Kelly et al. That's Vicki Kelly at the Carey Institute. I think she was at one point going to be a speaker today, but the schedule didn't work out, so you might hear from her directly at a future conference. But a lot of the research done at the Carey Institute has found that private well testing data and the impacts there that are similar to what I'll show with the public drinking water supply data. And we've already seen some public drinking water supplies significantly affected and increasingly so. So then our data, Riverkeeper, we've looked at the annual water quality reports for drinking water supplies, public water supplies in our watershed. We looked at the 2023 water reports first. That's the most recent year of data that's available. And we looked at the supplies serving 3,300 and over. That's a reporting threshold, so those reports are just easier to get at. There are a lot of reports out there for smaller communities too, and they're important as well. It's not that we don't care about them, they're just a little harder to get your hands on and look at comprehensively. So then when we looked at that data, we made some basic sorting on it. Is it groundwater or a surface water supply? What's the population served? Is there an environmental justice population served by the water supply? And for the purpose of what I'm going to report today, what are the highest sodium concentrations measured? Although we're looking at a range of contaminants, and I'm really interested in seeing how the data plays out about multiple contaminants that might be affecting a particular water source, and whether those water sources are serving large populations, whether they're serving environmental justice communities. Some of the early indicators are, that those are going to be concerns. So some of the key insights that I'll talk about here, more than half of the water supplies, again, among those 33 and under populations served, exceed the level at which people shouldn't drink their tap water if they're on very low sodium diets. That's according to the Department of Health threshold for protecting people who might have hypertension and suffer from the impacts of that condition. I find that shocking. More than half of the water supplies are serving water that people should not drink if they're on very low sodium diets. I think that's evidence that we've let this problem really get out from under us. And it's also a reason I want to thank you all and really put a spotlight on what you have done in the Adirondacks, because the research here, the best management practices that you've piloted, the focus on it through this conference and other things is putting a spotlight on the issue that's allowing us to take action statewide. It's really critical. We're seeing these impacts both in groundwater and surface water. And many are far in exceedance of that 20 milligrams per liter level. This data also suggests that there's widespread violation and exceedances of the state groundwater standards. Those are DEC standards for sodium. And we should expect ecological impacts at these concentrations in our surface waters. And again, I've already thanked you, so I'll thank you again for spotlighting the issue. So here's the Department of Health guideline. You can find this on their website. There's no drinking water standard for sodium. So there's no level at which there's the sodium in a drinking water supply will prompt an enforceable action. There's nothing that a community has to do if they've exceeded this level. Essentially, those that exceed the 20 milligrams per liter level have to put it in the annual drinking water quality report. And unless you're reading those reports pretty closely, you're not even going to recognize that it's an exceedance, because there'll just be a little footnote next to the sodium. And then down below in small writing, it'll say, that 20 milligrams per liter is considered an important threshold for certain people. And obviously, it's a concern primarily if you have high blood pressure or certain heart, kidney, or liver diseases. Now, there are a lot of us in the state that applies to, at least in some form. So, roughly a third of New York State residents are diagnosed with hypertension, high blood pressure, and heart disease is the leading cause of death in New York State. So how much are these things all connected? There was a question about public health before. I can't answer that. I'd like to know those answers. What actual risk population-wise are we kind of increasing by having this higher level of sodium in our drinking water? I can't say, but it's, these numbers speak for themselves, and that we've exceeded some health-based thresholds already. And we know that water is not going to be the biggest source of sodium in anyone's life. It's going to come from our diets. It's going to come from the processed foods and restaurant foods that we all enjoy. But the water can be an important component. And that's not the only drinking water contaminant that is like that. I think of PFAS, which is a hot contaminant that we're all concerned about right now. We know that comes from multiple sources as well, but we're very concerned about getting the levels down in drinking water to protect public health. And this might be analogous in some ways. All right, so I have to take my hat off to Dana with the really great mapping and the professional skills. This is my version of it with the low-tech tools I've got. This is preliminary research. We are going to formalize it and make it look prettier eventually, but for now, here's what you've got. The yellow dots are over that 20 milligrams per liter sodium, again, in a public drinking water supply. Orange indicate those water supplies over 40, so twice that threshold. And then red's 80 plus, 4 times that health threshold. So you can see a lot of water supplies affected. I've put an arrow pointing to that little green mountain at the top. That's Mount Marcy, the source of our Hudson River, here in the Adirondack Park. And then those other two areas point at Warrensburg and Queensbury, which I wanted to just draw attention to, because they were two Adirondack or Adirondack adjacent communities that came up. Warrensburg had two wells, one tested over 20 and the other over 50 in the latest results that were reported. And unlike the previous talk, I haven't done any kind of analysis to look at what the local land use is around those wells or anything like that that might indicate, you know, what might be at issue there. Queensbury is interesting, not in the park, but draws its water from the Hudson River behind the Sherman Island Dam. And there, the ranges reported were just under 20 to just over 20 milligrams per liter from the Hudson River itself. Interestingly, the Saratoga County Water Authority also draws water from the Hudson at that point and didn't report values over the 20 milligrams per liter. I would guess perhaps that might be because of different times of year tested and different base flow conditions that were captured, but that's totally a guess. Bears more looking into. But certainly that water in the Hudson that's being drawn for those communities at that point is heavily influenced by the Adirondack Park above it and certainly other communities. The highest, I should note, 190 milligrams of sodium, the village of Maybrook in Orange County on groundwater, so quite high level. So the median chloride concentrations reported in these water systems that are over the sodium threshold is about 86. And you know, on Brendan, the chart that he showed of the Mirror Lake, you know, those were some of the, I think, orangish, you know, color schemes. So just as a reference point, pretty salt impacted in the public water supplies. The highest was at 286, again, a groundwater source in southern Dutchess County. That's the area of that was studied by the Carey Institute with the groundwater that's kind of been mentioned a couple times here. We all know that salt levels are increasing. In public water supplies, you know, we could look back at 1,000 annual drinking water quality reports over time and try to track the trends in these places. We haven't done that. What we have done is just look at New York City's water reports. The New York City is uniquely data-rich in looking at its source waters because it has an unfiltered drinking water supply that is exempt from certain EPA requirements because it's a well-managed watershed. Serves half the population of New York State, 9.5 million people. That's in New York City as well as large parts of the Hudson Valley. So it's a really important drinking water source for all of the state of New York, and it's treated that way. So this is based on the watershed data that the city has reported, compared 2023 values to 1990 benchmarks. So the blue is the 1990 value, the red is the latest value, and these are averaged across multiple reservoirs in each of their watershed areas. The Delaware on the left, that's the western part of the Catskills. The Catskill system in the center, that's sort of the eastern part of the Catskills. And then the Croton system is east of Hudson, in kind of northern Westchester County, Putnam County, if you know the Hudson Valley at all. So this is the most heavily suburbanized area of the state and certainly of the watershed. And you see the impacts there. The increasing levels of sodium overall, not surprisingly, and really dramatically increasing in the more suburban areas where you have a lot more roads and a lot more people. Importantly, the tap water does not exceed 20 milligrams per liter because there's this giant watershed, multiple water sources, they're blending, they're mixing, and most of the water is coming from the Catskill and Delaware watersheds for the customers who are using that water. I tried to find out, there's a note in that report about a salinity task force report that's supposed to be out this year. I tried to find out before the conference if it's out, if it's coming, when it's coming, is it still on schedule? I don't know, but it might be a good one to learn from in the future. Other drinking water quality concerns, and we've heard about a couple of these. The corrosiveness, the change in water chemistry that comes from the chlorides really can increase lead leaching for the pipes that are in the system. It also can mobilize what the EPA calls chemical cocktails from source waters, and this graphic is from an EPA report on the subject. And again, not being a soil scientist, water chemist, I can't explain this in great detail, but again, the change in chemistry will allow for certain naturally occurring and unnaturally occurring constituents in the soils to become mobilized when that chemistry changes. So you can have not just the sodium, but also other contaminants that are introduced into the water supply because of that change in chemistry. And we haven't analyzed yet to see if there's evidence of that in these water supplies, but it is a concern. There could be a risk for increased risk for harmful algal blooms in some situations, and where there's an increase in algal production of any kind, harmful or not, you can have an increased risk of disinfection byproducts, obviously in the surface water supplies. And importantly, and this is an issue that I think in general we just as a society haven't quite caught up to, we're going to have a lot of effects on our drinking water quality from climate change and climate extremes. We're doing a lot of planning around climate on flooding and heat island effect and all these important impacts. And we're doing a lot of source water planning now to protect our drinking water sources in New York. But the two are still not communicating that much. We're not really perceiving all the risks to our water supplies from climate extremes. So in this case, like I said, the base flow of our streams tends to be the most contaminated with road salt. And so when we get these longer drought periods, that's going to concentrate those pollutants. And then there could be then future more cascading interactions with also extreme storms, maybe washing different things into those watersheds. At the same time, they're being delivered a heavier base flow of this changed chemistry. So there's a lot to learn there, and there are a lot of concerns emerging about what those sort of impacts could be. So I want to talk a little bit about the standards and thresholds here that are at play for these things. So the important thing is that while we have exceeded that 20 milligram per liter threshold for for sodium in so many water supplies, we haven't yet exceeded other health-based thresholds. There's a higher level of sodium concentration for those who are on sodium-restricted diets, but not very low sodium-restricted diets. We're not seeing that being exceeded yet. And the chloride, enforceable standard for chloride is also not being exceeded, although that's really an aesthetic standard, not a health-based standard. So we don't know what the chloride level might be important to watch for that corrosivity concern and for leaching from different watersheds. It could be potentially lower than this threshold. Again, we're seeing a lot of groundwater and surface water supplies above 20 milligrams per liter of sodium. DEC, our State Department of Environmental Conservation, has a groundwater standard for sodium that is also 20. So I think we can conclude that we are seeing widespread violations of that state standard. This was really what brought me to this issue. The Hudson River is an estuary. For those of you who don't know it well, it's tidal for 150 miles from New York Harbor up to Troy. It would be tidal up to Hudson Falls, but we've got the dams and locks starting at Troy. So we watch the concentration of salt in the Hudson from the seawater, and it's called the salt front. We set that threshold at a chloride of 100 milligrams per liter. And I became concerned about this working with those communities on the Hudson River who are drawing their drinking water from the freshwater portion of the Hudson, because in certain drought conditions, that seawater intrudes a little further north, and it can cause their sodium levels to spike and their chloride obviously too. We've successfully advocated for the state to start a modeling study to understand what the future conditions of that salt front will be. And concurrently, I was starting to learn that we've transformed all of our non-estuarine water sources into saltier water sources from the excess use of road salt over all these decades. 20 or more of the water supplies that we looked at are over that 100, that threshold for chloride, at which the Hudson is considered salty. So we've kind of made a lot of our drinking water estuarine, which again, I think is another alarm bell that we should just be waking up to and saying that things have gotten a little out of hand while we weren't looking. So you heard from Brendan talking about some of the impacts to aquatic life here in the park that are important thresholds, that 10 and 40 level of chloride. Again, the evidence from throughout the watershed is that we're seeing levels far and away above that in many places. And even if we're seeing it in the groundwater, we can anticipate that that's contributing to the base flow of streams. So what the safe level is for streams with a different bedrock chemistry, with a different underlying geology might be different, but we are certainly exceeding the levels that are considered safe here in the park for aquatic life. And it's important to note we do not have surface water standards. The DEC does not have standards under the Clean Water Act or environmental conservation law to say how much is too much for a flowing stream or lakes. And we need those. And we do have an opportunity, I'll mention at the end, the state is looking for information right now in order to be able to update a broad range of standards, but sodium and chloride certainly among them could be updated. The task force, as you know, recommended adopting these EPA recommended criteria for that purpose. And I hope I haven't confused you jumping around with the lines here, but just to point out that those are much, much higher than the safe thresholds that were established in the task force report as the scientifically based protective levels. So I think at a minimum, we can't accept these as the thresholds that the state will set because we need to protect our aquatic life with these standards, and we've clearly seen that we're running beyond that right now. Right, the task force also recommended using the more scientifically based thresholds for planning, such as you heard around Mirror Lake here. How can we get those thresholds here in this lake down to a safe level? It suggested using those scientifically based thresholds here in the park, but not elsewhere in the state. So I think it's a big question. And again, given that the momentum is coming out of the Adirondacks for all this, for you to be aware that these choices are really going to have a big impact throughout the state, and hopefully you can help us make sure we get the right protective standards statewide. So I do want to acknowledge some recent really positive steps. The DEC has updated the Water Quality Improvement Program in the last round. So a lot of these best management practices are now being supported with grants. So towns, I hope you're all aware, and I'm sure the DEC has information on its table about these, for those smarter blades, for the brining equipment, for other equipment needs to update and upgrade local equipment. There are now a lot of programs for that. They also, in the grant category for all water quality improvement programs, including these, there are extra points now awarded if the project will reduce pollution upstream of a drinking water source that's serving an environmental justice community. So that's an issue that Riverkeeper has been highlighting as a need to get our environmental justice policies aligned around drinking water source protection, since those water supplies typically are outside of the municipal control of those drinking the water. I mentioned there's a salt study modeling that's coming for the Hudson, which is a good step. And then we've heard about today a lot of local implementation of best management practices, which is really positive. And I'll point out my little town, Rhinebeck in the Hudson Valley, has also done this. This is my street. That's my neighbor's fence you can see on the right, and all those nice salt brine lines we switched over, and haven't had a real winter yet, but I also have not had any negative effects from making the change, and I'm really proud of my local leaders for taking those actions and for the highway department for implementing them so creatively. So what I'd like to leave you with are some thoughts for what we can do together and how we can join together to kind of turn the tide on this and build on the momentum that you've created here. We're going to need money, so coming into the state budgeting season in December and January, February, or March, we're going to need to make sure the Clean Water Infrastructure Act and the Environmental Protection Fund are fully funded, that we get the commitments from the legislature and the governor for those. That's how those grant programs get funded. It's how we implement a lot of this good work. There's a legislation that was proposed last session that we're going to go to bat for again this coming session, and that's the Road Salt Council and Advisory Committee. And in your packet, there's a piece of paper that has an explanation of that. Let your legislators know, review it, let your legislators know you support it. If you're part of an organization, get your organization to take a stand on that in support of it. It will essentially set up an interagency council between the DEC and the DOT primarily, and then an advisory council made up of nonprofit groups and scientists and others that you're familiar with working with in this room to try and assess the impacts of road salt, create a recommended limit on road salt use, recommend reduction practices and incentive programs, and other strategies, including updating some of the standards that I was talking about earlier. We also have to always go to bat for DEC and Department of Health staffing. They never have all the people they need to try and address the issues that are on our plates and that we're trying to get them to deal with, this among them. To update those standards, we have what's called in New York State a triennial review. So every 3 years under the Clean Water Act, New York State is supposed to submit to the US EPA all of its water quality standards for all of its surface waters and say, here are the thresholds we've set to make sure in this place we can drink, in this place we can swim, that place the fish survive. All those standards have to go to the EPA and pass EPA's review to say, yep, these do the job, these are up to snuff with the latest science. New York actually hasn't done that since 2008, so the triennial and triennial review is a little misnomer, but they are doing it now, and there's a solicitation for information that the DEC has active through, forget the date in November, I think the 10th. So basically a month is a great time for you to go find the triennial review on the DEC's website, submit data, submit information, submit your concern about sodium and chloride impacts, because that will help influence updating those standards appropriately. And then finally, we have a drinking water quality council in New York State. And we're going to be suggesting that council look at new maximum contaminant levels, MCLs, for sodium and chloride in drinking water, so we can make sure that those are actually calibrated to the right levels for protection. And I'm sure there are others, but these are some of the ones that are on our map and that hopefully we can work on together. And with that, thank you, and hopefully have time for a couple questions.
I have a question. Well, first, thank you so much. This was lovely as a scientist to contextualize the environmental health issues out there. It's really, really important to me. I was wondering if you could tell me on one of your first figures, the spatial distribution of the wells that are greater than 20 milligrams per liter. Was there any kind of pattern for the wells that didn't hit that 20 milligram per liter that you guys tested? And I guess what was that pattern if so?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's the kind of geospatial analysis we'd like to do, we haven't done yet. So right now, really just have these raw numbers of sort of like the broad impact, but not differentials about where the impact is greater or where it's not being felt. Just looking at the map, knowing the geography, You see a lot of exceedances closer to New York City, closer to the big highway corridors, so it's no question that's where more people live. I think it's kind of intuitive why we're seeing those impacts, and you kind of see along the major, road corridors clustered in the capital district, some of the higher population areas. So I don't think there's going to be wild surprises, but we haven't done that analysis.
Thank you.
Yeah.
One thing I'd like to point out, I'm scared because I actually grew up in the village of Maybrook.
Oh, wow.
In that little town that had the highest sodium levels. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that explains anything, but
My sister used to teach
I
school
thought I was
there
pretty.
too. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Morgan Hilliard. I recently graduated from Paul Smith College, and my senior capstone was actually focused on how road salt impacts drinking water, specifically in Saranac Lake.
Great.
With private wells and the town water. My question is, so when I was doing my research, one thing that I found very striking is that private well water is completely unregulated. And there's such a difference between the standards for people that live in towns than the standards that, of people that just have a private well.
Yeah.
And I guess my question is, how do you see in the future that the people with private wells have the same access to this vital information to make informed decisions on their health in the future? Because there's a big gap there, and I feel like something needs to be done for those people to get the same information that people in towns have.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I've relied on private well water most of my life. So there's been a perennial bill in the state legislature to try to require more testing of private wells. It's never mustered enough political capital to pass. So I don't know that its prospects have fundamentally changed. East Fishkill has come up a few times. That's where the Carey Institute did the study of private wells. But there's a well testing law in a couple of those southern Dutchess County towns that was actually inspired by chemical contamination that was discovered a couple decades ago from some manufacturing facilities that were using solvents. And it raised the level of concern. And so at the town level, they passed well testing laws at the point of real estate transfer. So if you buy a new house, already you have to get a test from the bank to show there's no bacteria. This expanded the number of constituents that were tested for, put them in a database, and then that's actually the basis for the research that has been done on now road salt impacts. So at the town level, that is another way it could be addressed through more local will. And if there's concern growing out, particularly around this issue, that might be a more fruitful political option in the short term.
Okay.
All right. Great. Thank you so
Dan.
much.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks so much, Dan. Appreciate that. Now, he'll be followed up with another Dan. It's my honor, and he is the one person between you and lunch, so not putting any pressure on him. But it is my honor to welcome our keynote speaker, a person who I've known and had the privilege of working with for over 20 years, since it was my fortunate opportunity to wind up here in the Adirondacks. He grew up in the North Country. He studied here. He went away to pursue further education to the highest level, and then he came back. He started at Paul Smith, built the Adirondack Watershed Institute into the well-recognized institute that it is right now, working on water quality and watershed research and monitoring the Adirondacks. But he did not stop there. He's now the president and leader of Paul Smith College. So please join me in welcoming a voice for the park, my good friend Dan Kelting. Dr. Dan.
That music is interesting. Thank you so much, Chris. And I, as you were speaking, I remember we met at a, I think it was is it Rosgood or Rosin Stream geomorphology thing. Yeah, and you were sitting right behind me. That was quite a number of years ago. So Really honored to be able to address everybody actually this morning. I am between you and lunch. My presentation is actually pretty short, so we will finish on time, guaranteed. So I've been working on this, or I started working on this topic back in 2008, which isn't too long ago, but it is a few years ago. And our initial work, we were approached by the Watershed Institute, that is, was approached by ADK Action to develop really do a literature review to understand the current state back in 2008 of the environmental human health impacts of road salt, and also come up with series of best management practices. And we wrapped that all up into a report that we've finally got published in 2010. And that report actually got a lot of use. And a lot of the practices that are in that report are practices that you've been hearing about this morning. So that was my introduction to the topic. But as I was doing my colleague Corey Laxton and I should say, at the Institute, as we were doing our review, we realized that, hey, we actually have a lot of information ourselves that we could bring to bear on this particular topic. So we started churning out our own publications. So what I'm going to do for you this morning is, so my title is Salinization of Adirondack Waters by Road Salt. I'm in the section of this conference that's focused on drinking water, groundwater, and I'm going to get there. So what I'm going to talk about is first, I'm going to talk about the paved road network in the Adirondacks and the amount of salt that has historically been utilized on that network. I'm going to connect the network to runoff, and then I'm going to talk about first salinization of lakes, then I'm going to move to salinization of streams, and then I'm going to end with the salinization of groundwater through a study that we did on private wells throughout the Adirondacks. And I think you're going to hear a lot of common themes with Brendan, with Dan, and also with, these are my notes right here. Dan and Dana. Sorry, Dana. I actually think Dana's on a conference call right now. Anyway, so first, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of salinization as a definition. So it's just water becoming more salty. So saline is salt. And this is due to accumulation of salts such as chloride, sodium, potassium, calcium, and magnesium. So when we're talking about, when I say salinization, it's just that the water is becoming progressively more salty. And for us today, we're talking about the main source of salinization to our fresh waters in the region is what we commonly call rock salt or road salt or sodium chloride. So when we look at the Adirondack Park, I mean, Brendan mentioned this in his talk this morning, the Adirondack Park is a 6 million acre wilderness area. And so most of the surface waters, the lakes and the streams, are surrounded by wilderness. But the park is actually dissected by quite an extensive paved road network. And so what we're looking at here is a map of the paved roads. So we have 10,555 lane miles of paved roads. And I've divided those into two categories. First, the red roads are what I call state roads. These are all roads that are under the jurisdiction of the New York State Department of Transportation, maintained by them using their standards, or contracted out to a town perhaps to maintain them, but they're maintained using the state standards. So the state highways are US Highway or Interstate 87. The remaining roads, about 3/4 of the roads in the park, shown in black, these are, so 7,725 lane miles of road. These are roads that are maintained by our local municipalities, so county, town, village. I think we have 105 towns and villages in the park, so we have potential for 105 different ways to manage our roads in the wintertime. So that's the road network, and it's very extensive through our wilderness, our 6 million acre wilderness. In terms of an annual basis, this entire network receives just under 193,000 tons of sodium chloride road salt per year. How this breaks down, so looking at that bar chart, about 80,000 tons is applied to the local road network, and the remaining, just about 110,000 tons or so, is applied to the state road network. And if you take the tonnage and divide it by the lane miles, you actually get the total application rate per lane mile over the course of a winter season. And when we do that, we see on a tons per lane mile basis, the local roads receive on average 10 tons of salt per lane mile, and the state roads receive on average about 38 tons per lane mile. So the state uses about 2.5 times more salt per lane mile than our local roads, local operators in general. Why is that? Well, when you look at the map, those red lines are literally the arteries. Those are the main roads, the arteries that are connecting our towns together, connecting the Adirondacks to the external world. Those are our high-speed, high-traffic roads. They're used for commerce. So they receive the highest levels of service in the park. And as part of DOT's management of these roads, they use high application rates of sodium chloride to achieve their objectives. On the local level, so we have local roads could be anywhere from a road that's maintained at the similar level as the state, all the way down to a street that may be just plowed. So while we see that on average the local roads receive 10 tons of salt per lane mile, some local roads receive much, much less than that. So they're just plowing and sanding with an itty-bitty amount of salt. Some local roads receive a similar rate as the state. So there's a lot of variability around how our local roads are treated in winter with respect to road salt application. But for the state roads, there's not much variability. They're very much treated the same across the park. And that's going to be very important when I start to show you the results of all the data that I'm going to be sharing with you in a minute. So that's the salt, that's the network of roads, and that's the salt use on the roads on an annual basis. So now I want to talk about the process of salinization. And so it begins with runoff. And so here we're looking at a section of State Route 30. This is just north of Paul Smith College where Brennan and I work. Eric Holman too is here, hey, Eric, and our student, it's great. So they're looking about a mile, looking south on Route 30. So each lane, so there's a car heading north, that northbound lane's going to get 35 tons of salt applied to it over the course of the winter, and the southbound lane is going to get 35 tons of salt applied to it in the winter. So you can see there's some meltwater coming off the road, and we sampled that meltwater, that was March 12, 2015, and that water had 5,000 ppm of chloride. So this is a meltwater coming off a state highway in the middle of the wilderness. Right? Brendan had 12,000 ppm coming off of a surface runoff into Mirror Lake. So this is 1/4 of the concentration of seawater, just to give you a frame of reference. So where's that water going? So it's heading towards the Osgood River. So it's in the Osgood River watershed. And as it's moving along, depending on whether or not the soils have thawed a little bit, some of that salt-laden water is going to percolate down into the soil. Some of it will be held in the soil via what we call a cation exchange, and the rest will make its way down into groundwater. And a lot of the water will continue to move along the surface and get into the river. So this process of runoff is happening everywhere, not just on this little section of Route 30 heading up to Malone. So again, back to the park-wide, what I showed you before, just under 193,000 tons of runoff per year. And I like to scale things up, all right, to give you a sense. So this has been happening for 40-something years, since 1980 at least, our second Winter Olympics, as Mayor Devlin would probably like to tell us. So 7.7 million tons of sodium chloride have been added to our roads in the Adirondacks over the last 40-plus years. And to put this in perspective, this would be 68,750 rail cars. So think of a coal train. That train was stretched from Paul Smith College, where I work now, down to Blacksburg, Virginia, where I went to graduate school, coincidentally. It'd be 720 miles long. So that's the amount of salt that has been brought into this park and applied to our road network over the past many, many decades. Where is it? It's not on the road, right? It's been washed off the road, and about half, if you read the literature, about half the runoff of road salt typically ends up in soil and groundwater, and the other half just runs off the surface water. So we could have millions of tons of sodium and chloride accumulated in our soils and groundwater throughout the Adirondacks. from this past history. So there's a very strong connection between road runoff and surface water. So my colleague Sean Regalado and I published a paper a few years ago. Very simple, water runs downhill. And so we did the GIS analysis, and we're just running water down from the road, runoff from the road, and seeing where it intersects downslope with either a lake or a pond or stream. All the red on there is waters, surface waters that are receiving road runoff. And so that's 6,000 miles of streams, or 52% of the total stream length in the park receives road runoff. And 195,000 acres of lakes, which some of those are big lakes, so 77% of total acres, or 820 lakes in the Adirondacks receive road runoff. So the potential, we think about the potential for regional salinization, given the connectivity between surface runoff and our surface waters, the potential is high. So the question is, okay, do we have regional salinization, given that the modeling would suggest that we should in fact see it? So to answer this question, so we'll look at lakes first. We did a study that was sponsored by ADK Action, and we put together a data set of 138 lakes, some from the ALTM, or Adirondack Long-Term Monitoring Program, and the rest were from the Adirondack Lake Assessment Program. It's a program that AWI, Adirondack Watershed Institute, Paul Smith, does in conjunction with Protect the Adirondacks. And what we did rather, is we divided those lakes into two different groups. So the blue circles, those are lakes in watersheds that don't have paved roads. And so we had 56 of those. And the other ones, the red circles, those are lakes and watersheds with paved roads, and so there's 82 of them. So what you're looking at here is just the result for chloride. And so we have chloride on the y-axis, or the vertical axis, in parts per million, the unit you've been seeing all morning. And there's two bars. So the blue bar represents the median chloride concentration for all those lakes, the 56 lakes that we sampled that were in watersheds without paved roads, and the red bar represents the 82 lakes, the median for 82 lakes for the watersheds that had paved roads. So Brandon talked about this baseline for least impacted lakes in the Adirondacks. That's where this comes from. I keep on use this as a pointer, but it's not a pointer. So less than 0.3 parts per million, it's actually 0.24 parts per million is the number that Brendan cited. That comes from this work. So we have very low chloride naturally in our waters in the Adirondacks. Where is chloride going to come from? It's coming from the geology, the weathering and release of elements from the rocks as they weather, or it's going to come from the atmosphere. So atmospheric deposition via snow and rainfall. Adirondacks is a granitic geology. Granitic geology is a very low concentration of chloride. If we were sedimentary, we would have more chloride, but we're granitic. So the natural source of chloride for us in terms of rock weathering just isn't there. And we're not by the ocean. If we were by the ocean, we'd actually get significant deposition of salt into the soils if we were by the ocean. So we're just in an area, by virtue of our geology and distance away from any superficial sources of chloride, that results in very, very low natural chloride, so 0.24 or less than 3. And you can see that little black bar on top is that's what we call the confidence interval around that median. It's very tight. So meaning that there's not a lot of variability when we measure these lakes that don't have any paved roads in their watersheds. They're all very similar, and again, that's related to the geology not having significant source of chloride to weather out. Looking at the roads, we see that the median is 7, so it's over 14 times higher than what we saw for no paved roads. And when you consider, Brendan mentioned 40-something, right? So Mirror Lake, the value for Mirror Lake was in the surface, about 40 parts per million chloride. This we see the median for all the samples in this data set, 7. I'm going to show you another slide a little bit, or next slide that will show you the actual data. But when you consider all the distribution of those dots, I think you'd agree that's a regional data set. So all those lakes that we sampled, both no roads and paved roads, are regional, where they represent the park. And so when we look at this data, we can safely conclude that, in fact, we do have regional salinization. So we do have regional salinization of our lakes by road salt. But also importantly, there's a tremendous amount of variability in each lake in terms of the chloride concentration that we measure. So that black bar you see on the red is much wider, taller than the black bar we see on the blue. So that's showing a lot of variability in the concentration. So what explains the variability in the chloride concentrations that we're seeing in lakes and watersheds with paved roads? So what explains it is one thing, which is pretty incredible. So we have chloride concentration on the wax, again, in parts per million. On the x-axis, you see, or horizontal axis, if you will, we see state road density. So it's the density of the red roads in lane miles per square mile of watershed area. And all those blue dots you see on there. So 84% of the variability in the chloride concentration that we measured in lakes and watersheds with paved roads is explained by the density of state roads in the watershed. And it's a very clear relationship. Why? Higher state road density means more salt, right? So you're applying more salt in the watershed. Equally important, we found no relationship between local road density and the concentration of chloride in the lakes. Why? This goes back to what I said earlier. Local roads are treated many different ways. So some are plowed, some are plowed and sanded, some are plowed and sanded with varying ranges of salt added to the sand, and some are plowed and salted. So there's just a tremendous amount of variability in how local roads are treated, so we wouldn't expect to see a correlation, unlike with the state roads, are all treated consistently the same, and we see that reflected in the results of the study. So our conclusion with this work that was published is that regional salinization of our lakes in the Adirondacks is largely from the salting practices used on state roads. Recognizing that at the local level, so this is the regional picture, recognizing at the local level, like Brendan showed Mirror Lake, our urban lake in the Adirondacks, the contribution of salt to the lake may come from many sources. So in that case, sidewalks, parking lots, and local streets, et cetera. But on the regional scale, the 6 million acre scale of the Adirondacks, this issue that we're facing is largely a function of what's happening on the state highways. So that's lakes. What about streams? We have a smaller data set with streams. We have 51 streams. And we did the same thing. We have 11 streams and watersheds with no paved roads. And we have 40 streams and watersheds with paved roads, mostly located up here in the northeastern quadrant of the Adirondacks. We have several down in Blue Mountain Lake. But we don't have that. We don't have that regional distribution with the others, but we have a fair number of samples there. Also, we in addition to looking at just grab samples for concentration, we have several of the watersheds instrumented and measured in such a way so we can calculate the loading. And what the loading is the pounds of chloride discharged per acre of watershed area. So I'm going to show you these loadings first. And just two watersheds, Upper Saranac Lake and Blue Mountain Lake watershed, which is located down more south central Adirondacks. Take a look at Upper Saranac Lake first. This is data we published in 2017. We're looking at May to October in 2015-16. So we're not applying salt, right? So this is the non-salt season, right? That's what this data is from. We have a reference watershed within the Upper Saranac watershed that has no roads. It's called Black Brook, and its loading is 1 pound of chloride per acre. And we'll contrast that with Cranberry Brook, which is bisected by State Route 30. and that's the only road within the Cranberry Brook watershed. And the loading for Cranberry Brook is 44 pounds of chloride per acre. This is in the summer, right? So we're seeing this loading. And what is this an indication of? Groundwater, retention and accumulation of chloride in soils and groundwater. Remember I said about half of that total load that's happened over 40 plus years is still here. So we're seeing that reflected in this loading measurements at Upper Saranac. Same thing in Blue Mountain Lake, same period. Here's the reference brook at less than 1. And then we have Museum Brook, which goes by Adirondack Experience, I guess they call it now, has State Route 28N, and that's the only road in this watershed, and it's loading at 22 pounds of chloride per acre of watershed area. Again, showing that we have accumulation of chloride, of salt in the watershed, and we're seeing high loads and this is loading to Blue Mountain Lake. Okay, so this is water going into Blue Mountain Lake from accumulated salt in the watershed over many decades. Last slide for streams. So we heard base flow was mentioned several times today. So this is the streams at their lowest flow. I think August, maybe September. The stream flow is being maintained by groundwater. So when you sample during base flow, you're actually sampling groundwater. So this is just taking our 51 streams and ranking them by the lowest concentration to the highest concentration in order. Again, parts per million. And the 11 streams without paved roads in their watersheds are the ones on the left. So they had the chloride concentration that's less than 0.5 parts per million. All the ones with paved roads, the lowest was 3 part per million. The highest for base flow was 195 parts per million in terms of chloride. So this is strongly indicative of groundwater pollution. So what we wanted to do next, in addition to the loading that I showed you before, what we wanted to do next was actually sample groundwater. So this was our last study. And what we did is we asked homeowners, so we're looking at private well owners. We asked well owners to participate in this study. It was free to them, so we would go and collect their water, or actually we would mail them a sampling bottle with instructions to collect. They would collect the sample, mail it back to us. We'd do the analysis. We'd send them back a nice report, and then we would include that analysis in our study. This work was sponsored by it was the Fund for Lake George Association. It was sponsored by ADK Action and a couple of other organizations. So here we go. Sorry, I missed a slide. Sorry. Let me go back. Actually, no, go forward. Go forward. Let's skip this slide. Go to the next one. Skip it. All right, let's do this. Okay, cool. I'll skip that. The last slide I also did was show you that there's a very strong connection between, you have all of our aquifers, the roads are over the top of the aquifers, runoff is going to go down the aquifer. That's all that was. So we have a study we have 528 private wells in the Adirondacks that participated in our study. And we divided those wells into 3 groups. 213 wells that receive no road runoff. The wellhead is up and away, uphill and away from the road. We had 143 wells that receive local road runoff. The wellhead is downslope. You're looking up at the road from your wellhead. And we had 173 wells downslope of state roads. The way that we classified them is basically using the model that I showed you before that Sean and I put together. Is you can see the state Route 8 there in red, and the pink, that's the road runoff, surface runoff generation from that network. If a wellhead overlaid that red, we assigned it state. You see the black roads, and the gray is the road runoff generation from the local roads. If a wellhead overlaid that, we assigned it local. And you can see the 2 orange dots. There's no road runoff. We assigned those none. So that's how we did this. And at the end, we ended up with this. So we have a very nice regional distribution of wells of all 3 types, non-local state, across the Adirondacks to help us answer the question of do we have regional contamination of groundwater by road salt in the Adirondacks. So I'm going to show you both sodium and chloride here. First, we'll take a look at sodium, and we'll look at the median, the maximum, and the percentage of wells that exceeded the guidance values. So as Dan mentioned, there's this guidance value of 20 parts per million that's out there. It's not regulatory, but it's out there. But it is for people that have hypertension issues, and they need to be on a low salt diet. So we're going to look at that exceedances relative to that guidance value. First, we're looking at, these are wells that don't receive road runoff. The median sodium concentration was 3 parts per million. The maximum measured out of over 100 wells was 17. Of course, so none of them exceeded the guidance value for sodium. Looking at wells that are receiving local road runoff, the median was 6, so double. It went from 3 to 6, so double. The maximum concentration of sodium was 403 parts per million, which I believe was quite a bit larger than any number, Dan, that you had presented right before me. And 20% of the wells that received local road runoff exceeded the guidance value. Why such a high maximum for the local? Because some local roads are salted, like I said before. So if your wellhead is downslope of a local road that receives similar salting rates as a state road, you're likely going to have very high sodium concentration. Looking at the state, the median jumps up to 33. The maximum is just under 2,000 parts per million. So these are wells located in the rural Adirondacks, right? Rural Adirondacks, 2,000 parts per million. 64%, or the majority of the wells sampled that received state road runoff, exceeded the 20 part per million guidance value. Notice the median 33, it went from 6 to 33. Why is it higher? Again, because the state road system is consistently treated with high amounts of road salt. So you're going to expect to see that median higher as well. Looking at chloride, same presentation. So Dan mentioned the 250 part per million guidance value. This is strictly an aesthetic, so it's a taste threshold. It's also coincidentally the threshold that the DEC uses to classify groundwater as saline. So if your groundwater is above 250 part per million, the DEC is going to classify it as saline. So it's got two dimensions to it, but as has been talked about already, they have nothing to do with like health. It's specific to chloride. So looking at the wells that don't receive paved road runoff, the median was 1. The maximum was 64, and again, none of those exceeded the guidance value. Looking at the wells that receive local road runoff, the median goes up to 8. The maximum is 390. Again, some of them are going to receive high salt depending on what the use is by the municipality. So 3% of those exceeded the guidance value. And looking at state, the median goes way up to 100. The maximum is 1,700, and 29% of those wells exceed the guidance value. Again, reflecting the consistency and higher rates of salt application on the state road network. So clearly a contamination at a regional scale by salt, both local and state, but much higher if your well happens to be located downslope of the state highway. Now, it's been mentioned, I think it was Dana, maybe Dan did too, talked a little bit more about chloride. So we have this 250 part per million guidance value related to taste, aesthetic, as a threshold from fresh to saline for DEC groundwater. But the real concern with chloride in the groundwater system isn't this threshold. It's the fact that chloride can be very corrosive. And this is something that Dana brought up, specifically related to lead. And Dana actually mentioned Flint, and that's Flint, Michigan. So I'm going to digress into Flint, Michigan a little bit, and to connect what happened to Flint, Michigan to what's happening here, potentially happening here in the Adirondacks. So let's go to Flint. And so we all probably remember this terrible story. It's an environmental justice story of epic proportions. So lead, right? We all remember the lead crisis in Flint, Michigan was terrible. Flint was a dying city. And so Flint doesn't have any money. So the managers of Flint decided they wanted to switch their water supply. So Flint, Michigan was getting their water from Detroit. City of Detroit was supplying their water. It's too expensive. They did have a water plant that was adjacent to the Flint River. They flipped that water plant back on. They could really reduce their costs of supplying drinking water to the folks at Flint. So they switched the water supply, and within weeks, the water became undrinkable, hazardous. People started getting sick within weeks. So what happened? What happened when they switched from Detroit to Flint River and caused people to get sick, largely from lead, but other contaminants, but largely from lead entering into their system? Just first to take a look at the water, you can see a sample from the water supply coming from the Flint versus the water that was coming from Detroit. So you can see the Detroit bottle is clear. The Flint bottle has got this orangey color that's showing there's corrosion. There's corrosion in the distribution system that's basically putting iron, the colors from iron, into the water. And then you see the Flint Hospital sampled in October of 2015. That's the water coming into the hospital. I mean, that's pretty bad. And that's indicative of corrosion. So the pipes are getting corroded from water coming from the Flint River. So why? Well, because chloride is highly corrosive. And so what happened in the Flint River, when they switched from Detroit to Flint, they didn't sample the Flint River water. And the Flint River had about 100 part per million chloride concentration. Some of that from road salt, but other sources because you're in a major municipality. And that water was highly corrosive. It got into the distribution system and started leaching a lot of lead. If they had sampled that, if they'd spent the money to sample the river, they could have actually done treatments to prevent this problem from happening in the first place, but they didn't do it. So looking at Detroit water, which is what Flint would have been drinking before they switched their source, was 2.3 parts per billion lead. The EPA guidance is 5 parts per billion lead. And the average of 272 homes that were sampled in Flint after they switched to Flint River was 27 parts per billion. So over 5 times the EPA value for lead, safe lead levels in your drinking water, all from switching to the source from Detroit to a chloride-laden river and having chloride be corrosive and leaching from the distribution system and also leaching from homes, older homes. So what does that have to do with the Adirondacks? So there's a long history of people complaining about their hot water heaters, their plumbing, their dishwashers being destroyed by salt, by their own drinking water, by their own well. So what we did to look at the corrosion issue is we used what's called the Larson-Skold index. You can see there's chloride on the top, and underneath is bicarbonate. This is the same index that was used by the folks that made the connection between the Flint River's corrosivity and the leaching of lead into people's drinking water. So we use the same exact mathematical model that they used, applied it to our data. And then what we did is we classified the water. If the index is less than 0.8, it's non-corrosive. If it's between 0.8 and 1.2, it's corrosive. And if it's greater than 1.2, the water is highly corrosive. So we applied that to our data. And so I'm going to show you that now. We'll have the percent of wells sampled on the vertical axis, and we'll look at the wells not receiving road runoff, second one, wells receiving local road runoff, and the third, wells receiving state road runoff. So looking at non-corrosive water, 95% of the wells that were sampled that don't receive road runoff had non-corrosive water. 70% of the wells that receive local road runoff had non-corrosive water. About 30% of the wells receiving state road runoff had non-corrosive water, meaning the majority of the wells downslope of state roads receive corrosive water. So we'll just add these other two bars. So only 5% will take the reverse. 5% of the wells that don't receive road runoff had corrosive water. 30% of the wells that receive local road runoff and corrosive water, almost 70% of the wells downslope of state roads have corrosive water. And this happens at much lower chloride concentrations than 250. You know, depending on the alkalinity of the water, this is happening down in the teens, 10 to 20 parts per million. So that 250 threshold is pretty meaningless. It's really the corrosivity of the water and what that may be doing to people's drinking water quality in their home that they may not know about. So I'm going to just show you the distribution of these wells exceeding both the sodium and chloride thresholds, and we'll wrap it up. So here's the park map again. So these, all the black dots, circles, these are all the wells that had sodium concentrations greater than 20 parts per million. So again, ones that are up and away, none. We had 20% of the local wells, or 28 wells sampled, exceeded 20 parts per million. 109 of the state wells, or 63%, exceeded the guidance value for sodium, and it's a regional data set. Right? They're not all clustered in some spot up in the northeast corner or southwest corner. These are all over the park, so this is regional contamination. Same thing for corrosivity. So none of the 5% of the wells upslope and away had corrosive water. 28% of the locals had corrosive, and the majority of the wells downslope of state roads had corrosive water, or 69%. And again, this is a regional phenomenon, it's a regional problem, given the distribution of the sampling sites across the Adirondacks. So when we think about the human health aspect, particularly related to lead, there are about 55,000 homes in the Adirondacks that are on private wells. 55,000. 40,000 of those, most of them are old, right? Most of these homes are old. 40,000 of these homes were built before what was called the Lead-Free Act in 1982 or 86 or something like that. So meaning that their plumbing has lead, significant amounts of lead in the solder, in the fixtures. 12,000 of those 40,000, by virtue of these percentages, may have corrosive water. So they have corrosive water that they're pumping out of the ground, moving through their aged infrastructure, and potentially leaching lead that they don't even know about because they're not testing for it into their drinking water, unbeknownst to them because of the chloride that's been applied to the road and has made it down into their drinking water, and it's made it corrosive. A lot of people experience this already because they complain that they have to replace their hot water heater, right, every X number of years because you have, you got dishwasher. You got it.
Dishwasher. I've spent $23,000 since 2018.
Exactly, bingo.
Because of the state and your road salt. Sorry.
So that's a corrosion, and that's what is causing it. All right, so let's wrap this up. We use a lot of salt. New York State is one of the largest users of road salt in the country.
And why is that? Because we're the largest producer of road salt.
Let me finish. So it's clearly resulted in regional contamination of both our surface and our groundwater resources. We've clearly made the connection at the regional scale that is the state maintenance of state roads that are the main source of salinization across the Adirondacks, but at the local level that may also include certainly parking lot sidewalks, municipal roads depending. Many private wells exceed the sodium guidelines, and many have highly corrosive water. And lastly, certainly we know your testimony is clear, ma'am. Corrosive water causes damage to your house infrastructure, may leach lead in our older homes, which is certainly a significant concern related to human health. And I think that's it. I finished on time. I have 8 seconds left.
I think we have time for one question, and then I'd like to have everyone go out. We are going to have a working lunch. People can pick up the boxed lunch and come back in. We will reconvene in 15 minutes to hear the presenters of our sponsors leading into the demo. So if there's one question, we can take it, or we can take lunch. Not seeing one? We got one. The winner.
Oh, good.
Hi, it's me again. I'm Morgan Hilliard, from a recent grad from Paul Smith College. And this is maybe, I don't know if this is a question for you or just an open-ended one just to think about, but I guess when I was doing my capstone on private well water and town water in Saranac Lake, I also kind of thought about Flint and how it's a huge, almost environmental justice issue because private well owners don't have that same information that towns do. And I guess, you know, I kind of asked this to somebody else, but I guess I'm just wondering how we're all going to come together to get that information to those people that need it. Because, like you said, they didn't test the Flint water before deciding to switch over. And all of these private well owners, they also don't know that information. It's hidden to them, and it's very expensive for a test. So I don't know if that's a question for you or just something to think about, but I think that's something that we all have to come together to kind of figure out. So, you know, all of these people who have absolutely no idea what is in their water can get that information.
So I'll just answer from. So I was on the Road Salt Task Force, governor appointee, and all my work related to this domain of it. And one of our recommendations from our task force was education. So purposefully reaching out to private homeowners to educate them on these issues, particularly like lead and other contaminants that may be in their groundwater. And also, we also recommended that resources be provided to them to allow them to have if they had a concern, to have their water tested for free. So they wouldn't have to bear their costs, because a lot of these folks are living down, a lot of people living downslope of a highway, close to the highway, aren't wealthy people, right? It's totally an environmental justice issue, as you say. So giving them resources, educational resources, financial resources, and then plugging them into really a network of support if they in fact, through the sampling, discover that their well is in fact contaminated, giving them the support network they need to get a solution, which is impossible for you to get on your own. So.
Okay, thank you all. Break for lunch, and we'll see you back in here. Thank you, Dan. See you back in here in 15.